What questions does the prospect of interfaith marriage raise for Shinto practitioners?
Many Japanese active in Shinto communities are also active in Buddhist circles. They do not draw the kind of clear boundaries between religious traditions that many members of other faiths may be inclined to draw. Traditional Japanese are therefore far less concerned with questions of religious affiliation than with cultural and ethnic identity. Significant numbers of Japanese would like to have their sons and daughters marry in a Shinto ceremony to keep ancient tradition intact. What is more important to many, however, is that their children marry other Japanese.
What are Muslim sermons like?
An address called the khutbah, pronounced khutbah, is a standard feature of every Friday congregational prayer service. Members of the congregation sit on the floor while the preacher stands near the niche, mihrab, or ascends a few steps of a pulpit called the minbar, pronounced minbar. In larger, more established mosques, the imam generally delivers the sermon on Fridays at the early afternoon congregational prayer. But either the imam or some other adult might also offer some reflections at other times when smaller groups gather for salat. Speakers have a wide range of appropriate topics from which to choose. High on the list are ethical concerns such as social responsibility, the need for parents to take an active part in their children's education, and speaking out in public venues about problems that need attention from concerned citizens. Speakers might also choose any of scores of devotional themes, such as cultivating one's relationship with God, or the need to set aside time for personal reading and reflection on the Quran. Preachers often tailor their sermons to a specific religious season, especially during Ramadan and pilgrimage season. Encouragement during the month-long fast is always helpful and welcome. Scripture naturally plays a major part in sermons, and preachers generally cite hadiths along with Quranic texts to illustrate their themes. Sermons vary in length from 5 or 10 minutes to perhaps a half hour for special occasions.
Take away the soul and what remains?
Nothing, apparently. But the Buddha was not attempting to empty life of its meaning. He wanted people to change their minds about what matters most. Look hard at what motivates you. What can make you nearly desperate to achieve this good or avoid that evil? Look carefully, the Buddha argued, and you will see that the qualities that attract or repel you are deceptions. Probe deeply into your choices and you will see that what you are really looking for you cannot get from this possession or that person. Each being is simply what it is, and it is a serious mistake to treat your world as though it existed for you. as if what you value in each thing is its value. In a sense, the Buddha argued, all things are empty, in that they simply do not possess the soul that a grasping, craving person invests them with. Pile all your expectations onto some person or object as though you truly hope it will deliver what you want, and you are making the fundamental mistake. The notion of non-soul, anatman, is difficult to understand, but it is one of the Buddha's most provocative teachings.
Have there been any sub-communities or denominations within Confucianism?
An early historian of Confucian tradition, Lu Xiang, 77–6 BCE, claimed that by his time the Confucians had divided into 103 schools of thought, each defined by its distinctive manner of interpreting the essential texts. Whether that was literally the case or not, it is clear that during the Song and later dynasties, several important schools developed within the larger phenomenon called Neo-Confucianism. The two main branches became known as the School of Principle and the School of Mind. According to their respective theoretical points of departure, the School of Principle, Li Shui, was also called the Chengzu School, combining the first names of the men it claims as its founders, Chen Yi, 1033–1107, and his brother Cheng Hao, 1032–85, and the later Zhu Shi, 1130–1200. The brothers Cheng developed a sophisticated theory in which principle, Li, meant not the classical Confucian rites and canons of social propriety, but an unchanging universal law inherent in all nature. Zhu Shi further refined that concept of principle, defining it as the great ultimate from which all forces in nature emerge, in what one might call a variety of process theology. Zhu Shi argued that the path to ethical development was the investigation of things. The other major branch of Neo-Confucian thinking was known as the School of Mind, Xin Shui. Wang Yangming, 1472–1529, was one of the school's leading lights. Principle, he argued, was not merely a transcendent and inaccessible cosmic force, but was one with the human mind. He taught that one could cultivate good conduct through reverent seriousness, a type of meditative discipline through which one could realize the unity of mind and principle.
What are the origins and practices of Zionism?
Near the end of the 19th century, many Jews in Eastern Europe began to view Israel as more than just a place for pilgrimages or for occasional settlement by strong believers. Encouraged by the rise of nationalism in Europe, certain Jews sought to return to the land of their ancestors and to make their homes there. This impulse gave rise to the political movement known as Zionism. The expression comes from the word Zion, which is a poetic term for the Holy Land. Zionists see Jews as more than a loosely bound group of religious believers. Politically, Zionists argue that Jews are bound to the land, to Israel, and that they were chosen for a role that is inextricably connected with Abraham. During the 1930s, with the rise of Nazism, this view became more urgent and provoked heated debate about the nature of Judaism.
How did Muslim history unfold after the age of the first great Caliphal dynasties?
Among the numerous dynasties and political regimes that ruled throughout the Mediterranean and Central and South Asia, several stand out. In Egypt, the Mamluk dynasty, 1250 to 1517, presided over 2.5 centuries of relative peace and prosperity throughout the central Middle East. They were patrons of the arts and architecture on a grand scale, under whom Cairo especially grew into a worthy rival of any great Mediterranean city. The Ottoman Turks, 1300 to 1921, supplanted the Mamluks as they expanded to conquer most of the former Byzantine Empire and more. To the east, the Safavid dynasty, 1501 to 1722, replaced the descendants of Genghis Khan, who had ruled Iraq and Iran for 250 years, establishing 12 Shia Islam, the official creed of the realm. The Safavids created splendid art and architecture in cities such as Isfahan.
How does the Buddhist tradition describe existence in general?
Buddhist teaching focuses on three fundamental qualities of all things. Two are fairly obvious to anyone who cares to look, and are at the heart of the experience of enlightenment. The first is hardship or suffering, the second impermanence. Nobody is immune to sadness and disappointment. No one has a lock on success and genuine contentment. And everything comes to an end. Everything. The third quality is far from obvious even to the most careful observer, but an awareness of it does follow from the realities of suffering and impermanence. That is the notion that there is no permanent, indestructible core or soul at the center of any being. Hindu tradition taught Siddhartha Gautama that at the center of each individual being was a self or Atman that survived physical death to be reincarnated in another life. Assuming the person died still enslaved by the effects of self-centered choices. The Buddha's reinterpretation of Hindu tradition on this point was so radical that it cuts right to the psychological bone.
Where does the word Muslim come from? Is it the same as Muslim?
Arabic is a Semitic language, as is its distant cousin Hebrew. Both languages are based on roots made up of three consonants. For example, many words can be derived from the root slm, shlm in Hebrew. Keep your eye on the uppercase letters to follow the root. A basic verb from that root, salima, means to be safe or whole. A related Arabic noun is salam, meaning peace, like the Hebrew shalom. Is part of a standard greeting among Muslims. When Arabic speakers want to build further meanings on a particular root, they do so by modifying the root with either prefixes, infixes, modifying interior letters, or suffixes. For example, to convey the notion of causing someone to be safe or at peace, one modifies the root salima so that it becomes aslama. In religious terms, to bring about a state of safety, peace, and wholeness, one has to get one's relationship to God in perfect order. That means letting God be God, and giving up all pretense at trying to do what only God can do, in short, surrendering to the supreme power. That state of surrender is called Islam. And a person who acts in such a way as to cause that state is called a Muslim. One of the first major non-Semitic languages early Muslim conquerors encountered was Persian, in which the U was pronounced as an O, and the I as an E. Hence the variation so common today, Muslim. Both mean exactly the same thing, the variations are entirely due to differences in pronunciation.
Is there a central Shinto teaching authority?
Shinto's close identification over the centuries with Japanese culture and imperial rule has sometimes made it appear that the royal administration functioned as a central religious authority. Certain regimes have made concerted efforts to encourage uniformity of traditional thinking among the Japanese people. And that has sometimes involved official statements about Shinto beliefs as well as attempts to centralize the organization of large numbers of shrines. In addition, training for Shinto ritual specialists in recent times has devolved on only a select few educational institutions very much associated with national identity. Those academic religious organizations have set themselves the task of clarifying and, in some cases, restructuring the countless elements of ancient Shinto tradition into a coherent system. Theirs has been an increasingly theological enterprise in modern times. Even so, Shinto tradition has remained quite fluid and inclusive, and far less identified with definitive teaching authority than, say, Roman Catholicism. Over the centuries, various centralized institutions have come and gone. The Institute of the Great Teaching, Daikyoin, for example, was motivated largely by the desire to root out Buddhist and Christian influences in 19th century Japan. The Bureau of Divinity, Jinjikan, sought to unify the administration of shrines and the appointment of priests. It is perhaps best to think of the centralized authority as regulating matters of practice rather than of belief, setting out detailed instructions for rituals, Jinjia Shaishiki, and for coordinating observances nationally.
What gender-related issues are important for religious Jews?
Concern for ritual purity has occupied a central place in much of Jewish tradition. Beginning with the Torah's laws of holiness and continuing in the observance of the stricter branches of Judaism. Matters related to female fertility, menstruation, and childbearing, for example, have received a great deal of attention. According to Scripture, menstruation renders a woman ritually unclean, as does the birth of a child, for 7 days if a boy, 14 if a girl. Gender has had significant implications in religious as well as social roles, especially in Orthodox and conservative communities. In modern times, the question of whether women should become rabbis has arisen. Reform and Reconstructionist communities do have increasing numbers of female rabbis, and the Conservative Jewish Theological Seminary of America began accepting female candidates not long ago. Orthodox communities still sponsor only men as candidates for the rabbinate.
Are there any organizations that have their own distinctive structures within Daoism?
Monastic institutions have been of great importance in the history of Daoism. Celibate monks adhere to demanding disciplinary codes. The 5 basic rules of Daoist monastic life are not, unlike some of the essential regulations of Buddhist laity. Monks are forbidden to take life, to eat meat or drink alcohol, to lie or steal, or to engage in sexual activity including, of course, marriage. But like their Buddhist counterparts, Daoist monks face far greater demands as well. Fasting is a large element in monastic life, including 10 fast days each month plus dozens of others scattered throughout the year. Historically, different orders required adherence to additional regulations varying in number from 10 to several dozen. Some orders structured their membership according to levels of spiritual attainment. For example, the Realization of Truth School had 3 grades among its monks. Noble transformation characterized the Master of Excellent Conduct, who successfully managed the first set of challenges. Abiding by a set of 300 specific regulations brought a monk to the level of Master of Noble Virtue. To achieve the level of nobility in the Dao, aspirants had to match the immortals themselves in virtue.
Is sacrifice important in Christian ritual?
Christians generally believe that the death of Christ on the cross replaced the ancient Jewish ritual of animal sacrifice, once integral to temple worship. The whole burnt offering known as the Holocaust was offered in atonement for sins. But Christ's death has redeemed humankind once and for all. Christians often speak of the Eucharist, divine liturgy, or Mass as an unbloody sacrifice. in which worshippers reenact symbolically Jesus' cosmically efficacious offering of himself. Sacrifice as a symbolic act still plays a role in the personal spirituality of many Christians. For example, charitable giving, support of one's local religious community, and doing without food or other pleasures for a time, can be a form of metaphorical sacrifice meant to heighten awareness of deeper spiritual values.
Do Christians have a holy city?
Members of various individual churches have come to associate sanctity with a number of places uniquely important for their traditions. For Mormons, several sites along the church's difficult path from New York to Nevada are holy in retrospect, as well as nostalgically sad, because they represent places from which Mormons were expelled or where they were persecuted. Above all stands Salt Lake City, founded by Brigham Young, and seat of the church. Geneva remains a city with overtones of sanctity for Christians of Calvinist traditions. For Western Catholics, Rome is especially holy because of its place at the center of the Church's entire history and because it is Catholicism's administrative home. But perhaps the majority of Christians consider Jerusalem the only genuinely holy city, and regard the surrounding territory as the Holy Land. Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, and the hundreds of lesser sites associated with the life and death of Jesus remain for many a source of spiritual strength and hope.
Have Muslims traditionally sent out missionaries to convert others?
Islam has been a missionary tradition since its earliest days. Muhammad's preaching eventually gathered a community of Meccans, which in turn grew dramatically after migrating to Medina in the Hijrah. Muslims believe in spreading the word whenever possible. Proselytizing is called inviting, dwa, pronounced dawa, others to join the community of Islam. Many regard it as a basic religious duty, second only to their fulfillment of the 5 pillars. Despite perceptions to the contrary, Islam has spread far more often through peaceful means than through the sword. Among the earliest dedicated missionaries were Sufis who traveled with Muslim merchants along the trade routes to establish communities all over Asia and Africa. Some larger mission-oriented organizations have developed and moved into new territory with local or governmental sponsorship in a home country. But Muslim missionary societies are generally fewer and smaller than their Christian counterparts.
What are Judaism's principal sacred writings?
The Hebrew Bible is a collection of some 39 shorter works composed and edited over nearly 1,000 years and gathered in 3 large literary/theological categories. The foundational texts are known variously as the Torah, the Pentateuch, or the 5 books of Moses. They are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. A second grouping is called the prophets, and that in turn is divided into the former and latter prophets. The former prophets include the historical books of Joshua, Judges, I and 2 Samuel, and I and 2 Kings. Among the latter prophets are the 3 major prophetic books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And the so-called 12 minor prophets, Hosea, or Osee, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Finally, a category of texts collectively known as the writings includes a fascinating selection of wisdom and prophetic literature and historical documents. The lone prophetic text here is the Book of Daniel. A set of wisdom books, some traditionally attributed to David and his son Solomon. Includes Psalms, Proverbs, Job, and a mini-anthology called the 5 Scrolls, or Megillot. These include the Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. 4 important historical books complete the category of the writings: Ezra, Nehemiah, and I and 2 Chronicles. Taken together, these sacred writings go by the acronym Tanakh, which is made up of the initial letters in the words Torah, Nevi'im, prophets, and Ketuvim, writings.
What sacred sources do the various denominations rely on?
During the so-called classical period, 500 BCE to 500 CE, especially, various denominations developed their own distinctive sacred texts called sutras, threads, aphorisms, shastras, treatises, rule, and agamas, what has come down. Sutras often take the form of commentary on earlier major texts and are major sources for the 6 philosophical schools called the Darshanas. Some philosophical texts are called shastras, but this category is best known as a vehicle for treatments of religious law. Agamas belonging to the various sects often include various types of material ranging from the mythic to the epic to the philosophical. Shivites generally use the term agama to describe their 28 canonical works, while Vaishnavite communities often call their unique scriptures samhitas. Collections, and Shakta groups prefer the term Tantra.
Is there a Shinto creed?
Shinto beliefs, like those of Daoism and the Chinese community traditions, have never been reduced to a concise formal summary statement. If one were to produce a brief Shinto creedal affirmation, it might go something like this. I believe that sacredness surrounds me, that it pervades all things including my very self, and that the all-suffusing divine presence is ultimately benevolent and meant to assure well-being and happiness for all who acknowledge it and strive to live in harmony with it. Shortly after the Meiji Restoration in 1868, the imperial authorities formulated the rough equivalent of a brief creedal statement, called the Three Great Teachings, in an attempt to enhance the emperor's status. The three teachings included patriotism and respect for the kami, the establishment of heavenly principles in relation to human culture, and dedication to the emperor and his pronouncements. Authorities interpreted the creed in the context of worship of the sun goddess Amaterasu, and the other chief deities in the creation myth. Although it approximated a creed in some ways, this statement was more like an acknowledgement of the importance of underlying religious conviction for the good order of Japanese society.
How important is ritual in Confucianism and CIT?
There is perhaps no more fundamental notion in Chinese religious thought than that of li, proper ritual. The Chinese term is composed of two elements meaning sacrifice and spirit more precisely. Contact with the upper world combined with a character that once depicted a sacred vessel. It applies to all religious ceremony, from the most popular to the most official imperial cultic worship. Historically overseen by a ministry of rites. State rituals have generally been the most formal and precise. Pre-modern ritual practice distinguished several levels of ceremony. Supreme offerings, performed mostly by the emperor himself, addressed heaven, earth, the forebears of the emperor and empress, and the deities of earth and seed. Middle offerings propitiated sun and moon, ancestors of previous reigns. The god of agriculture called Emperor Shen Nung, and the goddess of silk production, Lei Ziu. Lower offerings occurred in local or regional state temples and revered Guandi as deity of war, Wenzhong as deity of literature, and sage Emperor Fu Shi, among others. When Confucius spoke of Li, he had in mind all of these, plus the entire range of ceremonies enacted on a smaller scale or in private. But more than that, he conceived of Li as informing all proper human relationships.
Are there mythic elements in Buddhist tradition?
Mythic expression plays a far less central role in Buddhist teaching than in Hinduism. In fact, you might say one of the Buddha's main concerns was to demythologize Hindu tradition as he had received it. Hindu myth introduces believers to the impenetrable mystery of the divine while attempting to describe how the divine presence infuses the world of human experience. The Buddha cautioned against taking refuge in myth. However potent the divine presence may be, it does not relieve human beings of ultimate responsibility for their own choices. As in so many religious traditions, the foundational figure himself soon became the focal point of a new mythology. Even the most hardcore Theravada tradition leaves room for the Buddha to expand into a being of supramundane qualities. Wondrous tales of the Buddha's previous lives, the Jatakas radiate mythic energy. Some of the Mahayana denominations and sects, those of the widely popular Pure Land variety in particular, evolved their own complex descriptions of a multi-level cosmos, ruled by multiple Buddhas and populated by countless lesser spiritual powers as well. Vajrayana Buddhism, represented especially by various Tibetan lineages, retained much of ancient Hinduism's mythic spirit and cast of characters. But the Tibetans interiorized the myth, interpreting the many spiritual beings as projections of the inner powers with which one identifies through meditative practice. Even in popular Mahayana and the more esoteric Vajrayana teachings, mythic elements never attain quite the centrality they enjoy in Hindu tradition.
Are there any contemporary remnants of CIT?
Nearly a century has passed since the last emperor stepped down from the dragon throne. And CIT as an institution is little more than a fading memory. For many Chinese, CIT remains a historical curiosity. A large tourism industry has grown up around the preservation of major monuments such as the Forbidden City and the Temple of Heaven in Beijing. Chinese tourists flock to these great repositories of their ancient heritage. Mao Zedong and his political heirs considered the remnants of feudal and imperial society as reminders of a thoroughly discredited way of life. They are mere museum pieces to many, and relics of an oppressive past to others. But they remain important evidence in reconstructing the story of Chinese religion.
What is the ceremony of a Japanese wedding?
Contemporary Japanese weddings are celebrated in many ways, often combining traditional Japanese and Western elements side by side. Typically, a religious wedding ceremony is performed in Shinto style at a shrine located inside the hotel where the wedding celebration occurs. The ceremony is conducted by a Shinto priest and is attended only by the couple's closest family members. The couple is purified, drinks sake, and the groom reads a statement of commitment. The ceremony ends with symbolic offerings to the kami. The couple wears traditional Japanese garb. A reception is usually held after the ceremony. The wedding couple might welcome anywhere from 15 to 250 guests, relatives, friends, and co-workers. After the bride and groom are introduced, a meal is served and brief speeches are delivered. At the end of the party, the couple thank their guests for joining them on this important day. In recent years, many Japanese couples have incorporated traditionally Western elements into their weddings, for example, brides wearing white, Christian-style dresses. Sometimes the entire ceremony takes place in a Christian church and, according to a Christian-like ritual, even when the couple is not Christian. Many couples also perform other Western-style rituals, including cake cutting, an exchange of rings, and elaborate honeymoons.
What is the practice known as sati?
The word sati originally referred to a woman of virtue, a reference to a newly widowed individual who joined her husband in death by throwing herself on his funeral pyre. The name comes from Shiva's wife Sati, who committed suicide after her father insulted her new husband. Ritual suicide by widows spread through medieval times and continued well into the early modern era. Even after the practice was outlawed in 1829, it continued in many villages. Incidents of sati still occasionally make headlines, but increasing social action on behalf of women's rights continues to improve the situation all over India.
Do people ever decide they want to depart from the Shinto community?
Membership in traditions so closely identified with ethnicity as Shinto has a great deal to do with trends in society generally. That is of course true of most religious traditions. But here there are several features about Shinto worth noting. Japanese ethnicity does not imply adherence to Shinto beliefs and practices any more than Jewish ancestry implies that an individual actively participates in Judaic religious traditions. Shinto is integral to the fabric of Japanese life. Large numbers of Japan's present population do not engage in regular Shinto rituals at all, and many others are very selective as to their involvement. But that does not imply a deliberate choice to reject the ancient traditions as such. It does, however, underscore the impact of cultural and social change on all things traditional. Shinto tradition calls people to unhurried, careful attentiveness to the mysterious details of life. In a fast-paced, often tumultuous world, the drumbeat of change can easily drown out the sound of the drums that announce the beginning of a sacred ritual.
Who are the fathers of the Church and why are they important?
Some of Christianity's most important religious and theological literature dates from the 4th to the 8th centuries CE. During the patristic age, or late antiquity, dozens of influential authors from North Africa, through the central Middle East and Anatolia, now called Turkey, to Rome and westward even to Spain, wrote major works in Latin, Greek, and Syriac. Patristic literature includes virtually every type, from extensive biblical commentaries to sermons to theological treatises. Among the most important Latin fathers are Augustine, 354 to 430, Bishop of Hippo in North Africa and author of the monumental City of God and one of the best-known spiritual autobiographies, the Confessions. Tradition credits Augustine with a monastic rule that has influenced religious orders such as the Dominicans and Servites, as well as Ursuline and Visitation nuns. Major Greek fathers include the three Cappadocians, so called because they lived and worked in the province of Cappadocia in Asia Minor, now in east-central Turkey. More famous were Basil, c. 330–379, and his brother Gregory of Nyssa, c. 330–395. Gregory of Nazianzus, 329–389, like the other Gregory, was an outspoken bishop much involved in the theological controversies of the day. All three made critical contributions to the clarification of Christian doctrines about Christ and the Trinity. Less famous but very important in the early Christian history in the Eastern Mediterranean are the Syriac Fathers. They wrote in a Semitic language related to the Aramaic commonly spoken in the time of Jesus. Ephraim of Syria, 306–373, authored dozens of works, almost all in verse and including many hymns that are still sung in worship rituals.
When and where did Buddhism begin?
Buddhism began in a region of northeast India, part of which is present-day Nepal. During the mid-6th century BCE, the kingdom of Koshala ruled the area from its capital city of Shravasthi, also known as Kapilavastu. One of the realm's leading factions was the Shakya clan, traditionally identified as belonging to the Kshatriya or warrior caste. India at that time was politically fragmented into well over a dozen major regional powers. The vast majority of the population practiced forms of Hindu tradition under the leadership of a strong Brahmin priesthood. Ritual and belief centered largely on this worldly concerns, such as managing weather to ensure good harvest and curing illness. But some who had inherited the ancient tradition were beginning to question its efficacy. The famed holy city of Benares was part of the Koshala realm. There and elsewhere in the kingdom, individuals and small groups of religious seekers raised issues about possible life after death, including the notion of rebirth into other modes of existence. Within the Hindu tradition, the new questioning gave rise to the scriptures called the Upanishads. With their deep reflection on the nature of the self and of greater spiritual realities. Some of these new seekers parted company with mainstream Hindu tradition altogether, and eventually developed into whole new communities of belief and practice. One such community is now called the Jain tradition, named after the Jainas or spiritual conquerors to whom tradition attributes its founding spirit. The demanding ascetic discipline taught by Jainism's Tirthankaras, those who find crossing places in the river, formed one of the religious options available as early Buddhism developed. Buddhism itself would join Jainism as one of a number of splinter groups that, from a Hindu perspective, were unacceptable. These heretics got the name Nastika. those who deny the fundamentals of Hindu belief as it was evolving then. What we now call Buddhism thus grew out of an age of political and spiritual ferment, offering seekers one of a number of significant religious options.
Have women exercised leadership among Shinto practitioners?
In ancient times, women played an indispensable role as shamans in countless Shinto shrines. Even after imperial decrees reduced women's roles in shrine life, giving precedence to a male priesthood, women continued to fill some key positions. Well into the 16th century, for example, women functioned as priestesses in some shrines. The last of the priestesses was a young woman serving the Suwa shrine in Nagasaki. Women have long acted as spirit mediums consulted by many a priest over the centuries, as well as by individual worshippers. Restrictive legislation arising from the Meiji Restoration in 1868 dramatically curtailed women's official participation in shrine staff ministries. Only at the Ise Grand Shrine, sacred to the sun goddess Amaterasu, does a woman currently hold the position of high priestess. During the Second World War, many women took over priestly functions when their husbands departed for military service.
Have there been important Jewish mystics?
Esoteric interpretation of certain texts of the Hebrew Bible has formed the basis of developments in Jewish mysticism. Visionary accounts in which the prophet Ezekiel, for example, described seeing four wheels in the sky led to what is called Merkava, chariot or throne, mysticism. The Sefer Yetzirah, Book of Creation, an ancient cosmological treatise, eventually exercised great influence on mystical thinking. Traditional accounts trace the origins of mystical interpretation to 12th century Europe. There the originally Italian Colonimus family, transplanted to the Rhine Valley in Germany, became the nucleus of important developments. Samuel the Pious and son Judah began an important movement of Hasidic spirituality at Speyer, as did Eliezer ben Judah, d. 1228, at Worms. They were contemporary with similar developments among Christian Rhenish mystics, and devised a style of spiritual canticle called the Din Shamayim, Law of the Heavens, with a type of prayer, called Jacob's Ladder, that symbolized spiritual ascent. Further important developments occurred with a later generation of Iberian Jews. Abraham ben Samuel of Bulafia, 1240–1292, of Saragossa wrote prolifically of the need to achieve spiritual freedom, liberating the soul through a combined discipline of contemplation, reflection on mystical meanings of Hebrew letters, and the cultivation of what was in effect a kind of Jewish yoga. According to tradition, Abulafia's contemporary Moses ben Shem Tov of Leon 1240 to 1305, composed perhaps the single most influential mystical text, the Zohar, Book of Splendor. Based on a theory of emanation, the Zohar teaches that the divine presence becomes manifest in the material world through a series of 10 sephirot or spheres that symbolize the increasingly tangible presence of divine energy, the Shekinah. As a movement, Jewish mysticism generally goes by the name Kabbalah, reception. It was revived in the 16th century in Israel by Solomon Alcabez, 1505-84, and Isaac Luria, 1534-73.
What is Christian fundamentalism?
Christian fundamentalism as a specific movement began in the early 1900s. Following the tragic events of World War I. Central to the movement's teaching are the notions of biblical inerrancy and verbatim divine revelation. Inerrancy means that any contradictions apparent in the Bible result from human misunderstanding alone. The so-called Scopes monkey trial of 1925 brought fundamentalist concerns great notoriety with its public debate over the question of evolution. The prosecution argued that science teacher J.T. Scopes was in violation of Tennessee law for exposing students to a doctrine clearly at odds with the type of biblical interpretation now widely known as creationism. According to that view, God created the universe in 724 hour days, including a final day of rest exactly as written in the Bible. Scopes was convicted, but the fundamentalist movement failed to make as much progress in purging American Christianity of traces of modernism as its leaders had anticipated. A principal teaching is a type of biblical interpretation called dispensationalism, which divides history into 7 eras or dispensations that vary according to the quality of humanity's relationship with God. Believers await the 7th, the millennium, by cultivating a strict code of conduct designed to avoid contamination by such worldly behavior as smoking, dancing, gambling, and ostentatious dress. These and other beliefs and practices form the fundamental articles. Fundamentalists generally have avoided political involvement until recently. But groups like the Moral Majority, founded in 1979, have changed dramatically the public face of the movement.
What does the word conversion mean?
From the Latin convertere, meaning to turn about, conversion is a process of dramatic change. Religious conversion can mean a transfer of allegiance or membership from one religious tradition to another. When a conversion is formal or official, it can involve a repudiation of one's former beliefs. But it often means an affirmation of membership in the convert's new group. Many converts change from having no particular religious affiliation to active engagement in a community of faith. Recognition of a convert's acceptance into a new community varies widely. Some traditions require elaborate and lengthy preparation, including indoctrination in the new belief system, culminating in special ceremonies of initiation. Other traditions require minimal preparation and may mark a new member's acceptance with a simple welcoming announcement to the gathered congregation. Some traditions actively seek converts while others are not at all aggressive in this respect. Another kind of conversion is equally important. Great religious figures in many traditions talk of soul-shaking experiences that leave them searching for a new way of recommitting themselves spiritually. They often describe a dramatic change of heart that results not in their leaving one community of faith for another, but in a renewal and deeper understanding of their original faith commitments.
What signs or symbols distinguish Buddhist ritual specialists?
Priests who officiate in Buddhist temples that serve the public wear a variety of colors and use various implements. Priests often wear a special robe called a kashaya, kesa in Japan. The vestment is unusual in that it is typically a patchwork of many colors and textures, recalling the simplicity and poverty of the Buddha's earliest disciples. An abbreviated form of the kesa is the waijisa, a simple swatch of cloth worn over the shoulders. Some monastic priests in Japan carry a staff called a shakujo. 6 metal rings near the top make a jangling sound, alerting small defenseless creatures to remove themselves from harm's way. The Bodhisattva Jizo, usually dressed as a monk or priest, typically carries the staff. Within private or monastic settings, ritual specialists have an even greater diversity of signs and symbols. Since their rituals are often more esoteric and complex. Tibetan monks, for example, don very colorful headgear distinctive of their various lineages for special rituals. Tibetans and members of other esoteric sects also use a wider variety of special ritual objects than are used in popular denominations.
How are Christian religious leaders chosen, educated, and given authority?
Candidates for ministry and governance in most churches simply present themselves for admission to the appropriate educational branches of their organizations. Seminaries oversee the special ministerial training of church members. Many refer to the desire to enter the ministry as a vocation or a calling from God. In some cases, members of many denominations take their ministerial theological education at nunnery, multi-denominational seminaries or schools of divinity, generally emerging after 3 or 4 years with a Master of Divinity. Master of Divinity, degree or its equivalent. Some students may pursue further studies toward a Doctor of Ministry. D.Min, degree or a PhD, hence the common appellation Reverend Doctor. Protestant ministers more often than not obtain their pastoral appointments at local churches of their denominations through the mechanism of the call. whereby a congregation interviews prospective pastors and then invites its first choice. Catholic bishops generally appoint priests of their dioceses to specific parishes without consulting the local congregations. Orthodox and other Eastern Church administrators sometimes exercise a similar appointive authority.
Are doctrine and dogma important to Hindus?
Over the centuries, many important Hindu philosophers and theologians have devised elaborate and sophisticated systems of thought. Those systems are an attempt to structure essential elements of ancient traditions so as to show their internal logic and consistency. Their teachings have had the force of doctrine for those who subscribe to the various schools of thought. But they do not constitute a body of authoritative dogma as such. The vast majority of Hindus grow up hearing about the basic themes described above. Their parents and teachers pass along the traditional stories about the forces of good and evil. But few devout Hindus think of religious belief in terms of formal assent to a body of officially defined truths. Most Hindus have a sense of great flexibility with respect to the content of the faith.
Do Muslims celebrate events in connection with any other religious figures?
Popular practice in many places still includes annual commemorations of birthdays and death anniversaries of various important holy persons and friends of God. Birthday celebrations of members of the Prophet's family, such as Sayyidah Zainab, remain popular in places like Egypt. Lasting for up to 7 days, the festivities are like sprawling street parties. Crowds grow daily, as does the intensity of the celebration. Vendors sell food and souvenirs, and Quran reciters fill the air with sacred sounds from their booths up and down the streets. Mosques within the central area of celebration can be packed to overflowing. Birthdays of famous friends of God frequently include recitation of classic poems extolling the saints' spiritual achievements and glorious intimacy with God. Anniversaries of the death of God's special friends are also important in many regions, especially those further to the east, since holy persons are fully united with God at death. The occasions are sometimes referred to as the Saint's Wedding Day, URS, pronounced OORS. On the 6th of Rajab, many Indian Muslims, and members of other faiths as well, observe the URS of Muin ad-Din Kishti, founder of a famous Sufi order, at his tomb in the city of Ajmer.
What is Shinto and what are its origins?
Shinto derives from two Chinese words Shen, meaning deity, and Deo, meaning way. The Japanese reading of the Chinese expression comes out Kami no Michi, the path of the Kami. Since at least several centuries BCE, the Japanese have acknowledged the sacred presence and power of numinous beings called kami, high or superior beings. Until about the middle of the 6th century CE, the Japanese people evidently did not think of their ancient religious traditions as a separate system. So organically integrated were those traditions with their entire culture. An heritage that worship of the kami was largely assumed as the Japanese way. Only with the arrival of Buddhism, called in Japanese the way of the Buddha, Butsudo, did it become necessary to give the indigenous beliefs and practices a name to distinguish them from this imported tradition. Unlike many other major traditions, Shinto had neither a founder nor a single foundational figure who represents concrete historical origins. In a sense, Shinto is as old as Japan itself, somewhat the way Hinduism is as old as India. At its core, the way of the kami enshrines profound insights into the sacred character of all created nature. Shinto calls people to a deep awareness of the divine presence suffusing all things, to the challenge of personal and corporate responsibility for the stewardship of the world that is home, to unending gratitude for all that is good, and to a willingness to seek purification and forgiveness for humanly inevitable but avoidable lapses. Observe worshippers at a Shinto shrine. As Buddhism has temples, Shinto has shrines, and there can be little doubt of the sincere devotion that moves so many people to prayer and ritual expression of their beliefs.
Do deists and practitioners of CCT use relics?
Given the importance of ancestor veneration in Chinese religious traditions generally, one might expect that relics would enjoy considerable prominence. That does not appear to be the case, however. People pay homage to the dead in various ways, but rarely attribute to their mortal remains or residual personal effects the kind of miraculous power typically associated with relics in traditions like Buddhism and Christianity. Amulets of various kinds offer protection, and these may include the equivalent of second or third-class relics. Personal effects of a holy person, or items said to have come in contact with the holy remains.
Where do Jews live today? Any estimates of numbers available?
Few nations of the world were without significant Jewish communities in early modern times. Many of those diaspora communities have dwindled considerably since the formation of the State of Israel and the open invitation to Jews to return to the homeland. Several million Jews now live in Israel, but by far the single largest concentration of local Jewish communities is in the United States. Jews have thrived throughout the Americas. European Jewry suffered dramatic losses as a result of the Nazi-led Holocaust. But since World War II, Jewish communities have begun to re-establish themselves in many major European cities. Jews number some 14 to 15 million worldwide. In the United States, a Jewish population of around 4 to 4.5 million is associated through over 2,000 synagogues and temples.
What is a rite of passage?
In the life of every individual, certain times naturally stand out as particularly significant. Birth, the transition from childhood to adulthood, or puberty. The assumption of a new state in life, as in a marriage, and death are especially critical times. Religious traditions generally acknowledge these and other formative experiences by developing rituals designed to help people cope with the changes they bring. Sheer difficulty and challenge can sometimes be the distinguishing features of important moments or phases of a life. Confusion, sense of loss and grief, even overwhelming joy or feelings of limitless possibility can be cause for recourse to the comfort and direction rites of passage can afford. Rituals of this kind help believers by allowing them to step out of ordinary time and space for a while to regain their bearings. They can then return to real life feeling renewed, spiritually refreshed, and strengthened for the challenges ahead.
What kinds of rituals do Jews engage in privately or alone?
Home remains the principal place for Jewish prayer and religious observance. Traditional prayer includes the thrice daily Amidah, standing, prayer in morning, afternoon, and evening. The morning and evening prayers begin with benedictions that praise God's love of Israel as manifested in the creation of light and in the ordering of day and night. The Shema follows, acknowledging the one God's redemption of the people. At the center of all three prayers is the Shemona Esrei, or 18 blessings. Prayer ends with the Elenu, upon us praise is incumbent. Afternoon prayer usually adds Psalm 145. According to the Talmud, all Jews should pray 100 benedictions. Barakot, every day, in recognition of all things enjoyable, to give thanks. And prior to all other religious duties, in addition to the blessings that are part of daily prayers.